Tactical Space Lab is a research initiative focusing on the intersection of art and technology based in the inner west of Sydney, Australia. We're passionate about sharing knowledge and improving the accessibility and legibility of emerging technologies as creative tools, and have been hosting hands-on skills workshops for 5 to 12-year-olds, high school students and adults since 2007. In 2018, we started a program of experimental artist studios to critically explore virtual reality and digital technologies, looking to address the opaqueness of VR for artists and to push its development beyond simply an extension of film and video games. The 2018 program included the artists Joan Ross, Alex Seaton, John A. Douglas and Jason Wing, and was run with the support of the New South Wales State Government and the Australia Council for the Arts. Experiments from the program led to the commission of Joan Ross's VR experience Did You Ask the River by the Australian Centre for Moving Images. In 2020, we've been working with another 9 artists across diverse backgrounds and practices. These artists are Tarik Ahlip, Chidam Ayadamir, Kylie Banyard, Nick Cassey, John Gillies, Grace Kingston, Claudia Nicholson, Jason Fu, and Louise Zhang. Over this time, we're proud to have created virtual reality experiences that combine interactive technologies in novel and exciting ways that resonate with each artist's creative intention. The lab focuses on the development of new tools, new thinking, and new ways of using VR by providing a context for technology and concept-driven experimentation. Outcomes and knowledge gained through these experimental studios are shared widely through exhibitions, artist talks, adult and youth workshops, video documentation, and live streams. With the emergence of virtual reality technologies into the contemporary media landscape, driven predominantly by film and video game industries, it's essential creative practitioners have access to the skills and competencies needed to utilize, reappropriate, critically and creatively engage with, and even subvert these technologies. This lab addresses the lack of skills development opportunities available and provides a context for practice-based research contribution to ongoing development of VR's expressive potential. The lab prioritizes knowledge creation and sharing and experimentation, giving artists freedom to pursue ideas into unknown territory, take risks, and explore innovative use of technologies in their practice. Participating artists have diverse backgrounds and practices and have established themselves through the quality of their work as skilled innovators in their own fields.
Hi, Josh. So you're featuring at Ars Electronica a garden that includes 8 studios that introduced artists that don't usually practice with virtual reality into virtual reality. Tell me, you have been working with technologies that interpret reality or interpret spaces since, a decade or so?
I studied computer science and cybernetics back in around 2000. And what I'm doing now is sort of an extension of that. Basically, my way of looking at technology is as a set of tools for making sense of the world. When you're doing cybernetics, you have to think about how a robot or how a computer system is making sense of the world. And part of that process is trying to pick out what you think is important about the world and then represent that within the internals of the computer system.
Explain to me what kind of brought you to this sort of model that you have, this sort of incubator, bringing in artists and introducing them to virtual reality tools.
One part of it was that whole idea of demystifying VR. The idea that VR in any way is untouchable. You know, I've done workshops with 5-year-old kids, 5 to 12-year-old kids. I mean, at its core, building things in VR you can think of as like doing a diorama. You know, with a couple of toilet rolls in a shoebox sort of thing. The concept behind it is so straightforward. The bit where it starts to get exciting isn't your technical skill, it's the imagination that you bring to it. So the world of VR that's being driven by people who don't have a lot of imagination, but they've got heaps of money and heaps of technical skill, that's not really doing us any favors. What is exciting is bringing people from all over the place with different ways of thinking about storytelling or just forms of creative practice and just showing them how easy it is to get into VR. So Joan Ross and I decided to work together and to explore using VR in a practice, but I was kind of excited about the possibility of VR not working for a practice. So bringing that sort of 2D collage technique that she uses, trying to bring it into VR, finding that just the distracting novelty of the technology, for example, might totally blow the message out of the water of what Joan was supposed to say. I think it's really important to talk about the limitations of technologies, especially in the context of creative practices and art, where it's not just what the technology will allow, it's also what comes along with that particular way of seeing the world. There's definitely some very, very compelling things that come along with VR. For me, it feels very bodily to go into VR, and it's very hard to even really have any conscious say over whether you feel like you're in a space or not. It just happens when you put the headset on. The other reason is that it takes a form of storytelling that has definitely got a huge big history in computer games, which is a way of telling stories where you have agency in the process of progressing them. And there's all sorts of amazing things that you can do in storytelling from that particular perspective. Another exciting thing for me that VR does is it takes away the necessity of being totally habituated to the mouse and the keyboard or the console controller in order to be able to experience those. So you can put your grandmother into a space, and instead of them grabbing, saying walk forward and look over to your left, and they're trying to figure out what the mouse is doing, they can actually sort of more literally do that process.
So, it's quite interesting when you're describing how the artists are creating this new experience of what VR could be, and that the people that experience this, for instance, children, you've done some workshops with children, is that true?
Yeah, I love it because it's really exciting for me to think that the first VR experience that they ever see are artworks. It's not something that's been bought, it's something that's been made by people within their local community as well often. And then the second VR experience that they see is one that they have just made. Them and their classmates have got hands-on, and there's bits of their own stories and things that they've put in that's part of that. So I really like that idea.
Can you tell me a bit about the Sydney cultural scene, especially what has happened during COVID-19? Like there were spaces like Carriage Works that I know that were sort of had to shut down. How did they respond to kind of working out ways to reach audiences?
It's not as if it's a brand new thing to imagine that there are some people who can't come to your gallery or museum. And it's notable that the first time that they start putting concerted effort into providing access to these artworks is when the most able-bodied bulk of their audience is now somehow unable to come.
I saw you on social media again sort of bringing up this work with the Museums of Contemporary Art during COVID lockdown, saying, hey, I built this sort of virtual model of the museum. Your museum's closed down. Do you think this would be an interesting time to sort of reinvestigate this kind of way of working with the collection that you have? And did you hear anything back? Or
I didn't hear anything. It's an interesting time, especially because the MCA has just got into a fair bit of trouble around their policy of working with employees of colour, engaging people of colour. And as an extension of that thinking around using the MCA work, I would really like to invite a very, very broad group of people to come in and stage a virtual intervention or a virtual just sort of stating their piece within the MCA reconstruction. Me taking a sort of backseat to just provide the staging for people to present and do what they would want to in that virtual context. So I think it's an opportunity to take advantage of the virtuality of that space as a symbolic gesture.
So in this sense, you've mentioned this earlier to me, this idea of taking the magic realism of virtual space seriously. And what you're discussing here is kind of occupying a virtual space as a form of protest. Do you think this is possible to have virtual or like strong symbolic occupation of space or protesting within virtual spaces?
There's different sort of orders maybe of this symbolism and virtuality of space. So you could say, if you do an augmented reality bit of graffiti that no one else is going to see apart from other people who have sort of opted into seeing it, that's one thing that is in no way really a grand protest. But then to say, okay, well, in some ways statues in public space it's not just the statue itself, it imbues this particular symbolic meaning over that space and over that land that it's on and all that sort of stuff. And it's like that there, and all of the controversy over certain statues is maybe another way of thinking about the virtuality of a public space. Because what it's like laying claim to sovereignty in particular ways, laying claim to a particular version of history, that statue becomes a beacon out, sort of fills up that space with a particular narrative.
You're saying that the sort of symbolic representation that kind of creates a space and creates the sort of aesthetics of a virtual space. So for instance, like what you've created with your Mozilla garden for the Mozilla hub for Ars Electronica. This is a virtual space with virtual symbols, but what we have in our real gardens, in our cities, our real parks, these symbols are also kind of creating these symbolic spaces which are essentially virtual. And do you think that by engaging with these technologies that kind of reconsider our perception of space, we have a better understanding of the virtual symbolic spaces in our own physical public spaces?
I would say one other reason why I'm uncomfortable with augmented reality is because it brushes over the fact that you're sharing space. It's almost like NIMBYism and like the perfect Facebook bubble, where it's not just the concepts and the sort of chat conversations that you're having, it's actually your shared perception of concrete things in a world that you no longer have to opt into. I think the jury's still out, because there's always that problem that there can be virtual spaces that can accommodate your way of thinking without ever having to work at that idea of community building where you're reconciling difference and sort of trying to negotiate responsibility.
And this idea of like social media was kind of to really sort of amplify social communities, and it's done the complete opposite. It's sort of become a forum for sort of like trolls and hate and disinformation. And again, we have like with these virtual spaces and things like Mozilla hubs as being sort of like, I know you can't go down to the park right now and have a picnic with your friends, but here we'll put you in a little Lego body, go sort of like hover over there and try to recreate it.
I'd argue that a whole bunch of problems along the lines of things like responding to fake news, for example, and the inability for even people who come from fairly similar political sort of areas of the spectrum to be able to have useful conversation that just doesn't turn into a giant shit fight, basically, is a question of community building. Technology is a community building. So when you say Mozilla hubs, you know, if you look at it, it looks like a VR social community technology, but all they've got is like the semblance, the visual semblance of a community, but without any of that sort of thought of people coming together and working and negotiating with each other.
So this was kind of the original like sort of utopian ideal of what the World Wide Web, and what we've seen now is this platformization, these closed gardens that have even further closed by our social groups and our social connections.
The theme of garden is an interesting one. I think conceptually the idea of a garden comes from a microcosm metaphor for the macrocosm. It is kind of this reflection pool there that doesn't have necessarily any connections to anything else. And then there's all the stuff of the picturesque that comes with the garden, and that idea of sort of curating or mediating nature into something that is a particular way of viewing things.
Yeah, essentially it's always this closed garden idea, that the idea of the App Store is a closed garden.
Yeah. The park versus that idea of the privately owned little walled garden might be a nicer way of thinking about things, where there's a necessity to have compromise of different interests and ideas is quite nice. Yeah, as a alternative metaphor for ways of building virtuality. It's just what is the reward? Why would you choose that? As something to go to if you had the option of your private garden. I'd say that kind of it's similar to what we're trying to do at Tactical Space Lab, where we're bringing in different voices and different perspectives just to make sure that we don't have a monocultural view of, you know, what VR should be dictated by just some people, that we all mix it up together and have a more nuanced and articulated and informed view of what technology can be and how it works in the world.